Hello, my name is Paul Murphy, Managing Director at Gowling WLG, and we're here today with Michael Shellenberger, President of Environmental Progress. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me in.
Great. Just to get the conversation started, tell us a little bit about how environmental progress came about and sort of this idea of the eco-modernist movement that you're a part of.
Sure. So I'm a lifelong environmentalist and progressive, raised that way by lefty liberal parents in Colorado. I moved to California after college and immediately fell in with doing a lot of environmental advocacy. And this was in the late 90s. It became very clear that climate change was a big issue to work on. Early 2000s, we put together a coalition of labor unions and environmentalists to advocate for a big investment in renewables that eventually Barack Obama picked up. We had a big campaign trying to persuade the Democrats to do that. We did. And in that time, an environmentalist who I really respected named Stuart Brand, he started the Whole Earth Catalog in the 60s, came out as pro-nuclear, and when that happened, all of us who were pretty anti-nuclear at the time were like, okay, we need to give this technology a second look. And, for me, it was first confronting my biggest fears around things like Chernobyl and the waste and what do and is it expensive? Is it cheap? What is it? And after a few years of really looking into it, ended up changing my mind and became a supporter of nuclear power. But even then, it wasn't I think for people that were our friends, they were still a little bit like, do we really need it? What is your broader vision? And so we wrote this manifesto that you described, an eco-modernist manifesto, with Stuart as one of the co-authors, published that in 2015. And one of the issues that we raised in there, it was a broader picture of how do you save the environment and lift everybody out of poverty. And one of the issues that we raised was just, that we have nuclear plants at risk of being closed around the world. So I felt like that was an important issue that I wanted to get back into doing more advocacy since I was at a think tank. And I've always been a little bit between being a researcher and an advocate. And I started Environmental Progress, and the first big issue that we worked on for the last couple of years was keeping our nuclear plants online and preventing them from being replaced by fossil fuels.
I mean, in the presentation that you gave earlier today in Ottawa, you gave a nice history about how in the very early days of civilian nuclear power, there were some prominent people in the environmental movement who were pro-nuclear. And then how over time the environmental movement changed to become very anti-nuclear. Now we're seeing groups such as yours and some other leading environmentalists coming out and saying that we need to rethink that position and nuclear needs to be part of the solution. How do you see that message being received by the non-converted within the environmental movement? How would you categorize that, being someone yourself who was, as you say, anti-nuclear and now has evolved into a very different position? How does that play with everybody else that used to be your peers in the anti-nuclear movement?
Yeah, it's a really interesting moment, like you said. I mean, one of the big surprises for me in doing research for my next book was not only that environmentalists were in favor of nuclear power in the 60s, they were like the biggest advocates of it because it doesn't produce any smoke or air pollution and it requires very little land. And environmentalists, we called conservationists at the time, they were concerned about hydroelectric dams because they require huge amounts of land and destroying rivers. And coal, and nuclear was this amazing alternative. So then what changed it was really the view that nuclear's problem was that it produced too much energy and that it would cause humans to sort of overpopulate and overconsume and destroy the planet. And so the opposition to nuclear from the beginning was actually that it created too much abundant and cheap electricity. And so in some ways, the advocacy of energy efficiency and renewables has all been an effort to reduce how much energy we use. Since we came out in support of it, and including in this framework of eco-modernism, we were explicitly going back to where conservationists were in the 60s and saying, look, there's 7 billion humans, there's going to be 10 billion in the blink of an eye. Most of the people are poor and need to consume more energy. How are we going to do that and also deal with climate change? It's not going to be by everybody just volunteering to be poor. Most people want to get wealthier, including people that are already wealthy. And so nuclear became a really key way to do that. I would say that we've persuaded a lot of people that are concerned about climate change to change their views. I think there's still a hardcore say 30% of the population that's never going to change their mind about nuclear, and I think that's fine. Conservatives, the United States Republicans, or other parts of the world they call them liberals or whatever, but people that are more right of center have been okay with nuclear for decades. They don't seem to have the concerns that have come from the left. So in some ways you kind of go, well, there's a 30% conservatives that are already for it, 30% liberals or progressives that are against it. So we've always been competing for that middle group. And I think the big change has been climate change. If you really think climate change is a serious risk, then how could you say no to nuclear?
I mean, we hear a lot about the 2-degree scenario and projections for can we get there. Is there, in your mind, any way that we can achieve the 2-degree scenario or anything close, or maybe more ambitious if we want to be really positive, without nuclear being part of the mix?
Yeah, I mean, so no way we can achieve limit temperature rises to 2 degrees without nuclear. Might not be possible to do it with nuclear. I've never been a big temperature. I think it's sort of false precision to sort of be like, we're going to have these policies and they're going to, for a lot of different reasons. One of which is just, it's just a lot of uncertainty in how much warming you get with more carbon dioxide. We get more warming, but the amount of temperature increase you get is not so obvious, and I don't think it's super important to be that precise. The most important thing is just to accelerate the transition from fossil fuels to clean sources of energy. And why would you take off the table our single largest source of clean energy in doing that process? So yeah, I mean, and I think that's now a pretty mainstream view among the United Nations, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Most environmentalists at this point, I think, sort of acknowledge that nuclear needs to play a role, and maybe the debate's just about how big of a role it needs to play.
We talk about how the energy industry is evolving, and one of the things you see in the discussions is distributed generation. Let's go smaller, more local, and that seems to be the flavor of the month or of the year, whatever label you want to put on it. I mean, where do you see distributed generation versus baseload power in terms of solving the larger problem, solving the global problem of climate change and fostering development? Do you see them as mutually exclusive? Do you some people say baseload generation is the past, they're the dinosaurs. But then you say, but when the distributed generation doesn't work, who's going to be, where's the backbone?
Right.
And so I guess the first question is, does there always still need to be that backbone, or do you see a scenario where distributed generation can achieve all the goals that you would like to see from a clean energy and development perspective? Do we still sort of is there still a need for the big utilities?
Right. Well, this is a very interesting question. I mean, so I think it's helpful to kind of look at a broader picture of human development over time. And so, when everybody was a farmer, we produced our own energy, mostly with wood. We produced most of our own food. Well, now, only 1% of us or 3% of us are farmers. Most of us buy our energy and buy our food from somebody else. So both food and energy production, all forms of production, have become more centralized over the last couple hundred years. And I think most of us are good with that. We have a little garden in my backyard, but if we tried to live on it, we would starve to death, right? So, and in terms of producing energy locally, we got solar panels in our backyard, but same story. We couldn't live on that. And I think there's another problem, which is just, it reduces the efficiency of energy and food production to decentralize it. And it's funny because people go, well, I'm producing my own energy because I have solar panels, but you didn't make those solar panels. They were made in a big centralized factory in China and then shipped over to us. So even the extent to which solar is considered decentralized, I don't really agree with. I think a heavily centralized production of solar panels, people get this idea that we're going to move to decentralized because of cell phones and the computing revolution, which has decentralized production of knowledge. But that's totally different field than energy. And it's also worth noting that all of our cell phones and microchips and whatever are still made in really big factories. So that the economies of scale somehow didn't go away.
Within the environmental community, there are people out there that are espousing this idea that we can go to 100% renewable generation, that the whole grid can be based on renewables. You've debated Professor Jacobson at Stanford. He was basically refuted by a lot of preeminent scientists. Yet this view still is out there. It's still being promoted. How destructive is that to the larger goals that are being trying to achieve? And, is there a way to reconcile a place for renewables, a place for baseload, in a way that actually solves the mathematical problem, as opposed to maybe these idealized scenarios that,
Right.
according to a lot of preeminent scientists, just don't hold up, but people hear it, it sounds nice, and they latch onto it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it is. And it sort of goes, what's the problem you want to solve? What's the goal? Do we want to solve climate change, or do we want to have 100% renewables? In terms of renewables, I mean, where do you have 100% renewables? You have them in really poor countries, like in South Asia or in Central Africa. I spent a bunch of time in Central Africa. Again, people are using 100% renewables because they're using wood and dung as their main source of energy. That's not something I think any of us would want to. None of us would want to live like that, and the folks that you interview there don't want to live like that. So, I think you could go, well, we could all go to 100% renewables, but why would we want to? Because then you couldn't have prosperity and you couldn't have environmental protection. The only way that the wildlife in countries returns is when you stop using the forests for your energy and you let nature be just nature and not natural resources. So the problem with renewables, ironically, for people that advocate for it for environmental reasons, it just requires a lot more natural resource use. Something I didn't realize until we started really looking at it. But solar and wind and hydroelectricity and biomass, they all just require using a lot more of the earth. And so if you care about the natural world, then you should want to move away from those forms of energy production.
Germany, after Fukushima, made the big decision to close down its nuclear program. Maybe overreactionary to events. There were political dimensions to it, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And they've embraced this large-scale renewables program. Yet we see that the results maybe are falling a little bit, if not a lot, short of their goals. What lessons can we take from the German experience? And is that something that people are going to look at and say, okay, this was a huge mistake, or they got some things right and they should have done some things differently? What lessons do we take from what they've been doing and maybe where they're headed?
Well, Germany and my home state of California, I think, are both good examples of what not to do if you want to either protect your environment or protect your economy. Just on economics, German electricity prices have gone up 50% over the 10 years that they've been doing renewables. California's electricity prices increased 5 times more than they increased at the national level since 2011. Carbon emissions have gone up in Germany. Carbon emissions went up in California. So both have done a lot of renewables, but because they've been taking down their nuclear plants and having to replace them with fossil fuels, their emissions have been going up. So I mean, I think the interesting thing is, I think the truth is finally getting out about Germany. And so last year you saw Germany announced that they were going to abandon their climate target for 2020. It also came out around the same time that they destroyed an entire village and separately an ancient church in order to create a new coal mine. And after that happened, the French president, who had said he wanted to reduce his country's reliance on nuclear, came out and said, when countries like Germany replace their nuclear plants or try, take them down, their fossil fuel increases, their emissions go up. I'm not going to do that. So I think we've already started to see a reaction, I think a positive one from France and I think some other parts of the world.
Is there a bit of hypocrisy in all this too, in the sense that, I mean, just being an American sitting from afar and looking, we're both from the United States, but you look at Germany and you say, if you don't like nuclear, that's fine. That's your choice and you live with your choices. But then why buy nuclear power from France? I mean, and that's the part that I don't understand. I mean, in your travels, how do you see people sort of defend these positions and say, well, we're shutting down all our nuclear, but, oh, thank God the French will sell us their nuclear power?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is people are pretty deceptive about it. I mean, they'll say things like, we've replaced our fossil fuels with renewables in Germany. Well, that's just not true. Sometimes they'll just cite capacity rather than generation, which is just a technical trick. But I think that's, again, starting to change. I mean, I was invited to give a very high-level briefing to the Japanese government at the end of last year, and I was supposed to have one of my respondents was a prominent renewable energy expert from Germany. First, they said, well, she's going to have to literally phone it in. I flew to Germany, I flew to Japan, and she said, oh, well, she's going to do it by teleconference. And they said, oh, she got sick, can't do it. So I think she was nervous about being confronted with the data. And the other thing is just, it's only been 10 years that the world has been doing a lot of solar and wind. And so, it was one that you could kind of go, hey, that's probably not going to work out given that it's intermittent. But now we've got 10 years of data, and I think that it's having a big impact on how people think about it.
You did a lot of work in Korea recently, and I found it incredible when you look at the success that Korea has had, South Korea, with their nuclear program and how they imported the technology, developed it further, have had a very successful, not only new build program, but availability. It's powered their country. Not only did the guy who won take an anti-nuclear position, but a lot of the other leading candidates were also anti-nuclear. And I found that shocking in a country that had such a great nuclear story. What did you attribute that to? And then maybe talk about how attitudes have evolved since the election.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that could be all we talk about.
Yeah.
On the one hand, every country is different, and on the other hand, every country is the same. Every country's the same in that the fears that people have of nuclear are just the same everywhere. I mean, in some places it's more about waste, in some places more about meltdowns. It's really the same fears. What's different is that in South Korea, there was really a changing of the guard from a kind of more conservative, post-war, really the first kind of ruling governing group after they got democracy in the late 80s, to now a more liberal government. And that new liberal government had more anti-nuclear attitudes. That was part of what's going on. So there's just sort of a being different than the last guy. Then, of course, there's a backlash against Fukushima. Fukushima scared the Korean people. And then they had a big movie. I mean, it's just sometimes a big movie, a very scary anti-nuclear movie that came out at the end of 2016. So I think all those forces led to a backlash against nuclear, but that story's not over because they then put it to a citizens' jury comprised of several hundred ordinary folks to deliberate on the question of whether to continue with nuclear or not at the end of last year. And they polled them all. They were 60% against nuclear when they started, but after they considered all the facts, they were 60% in favor. So I think the truth still matters. The facts still matter. People have to understand why. It's not just like, I think in the past, the industry has been very much like, let me educate you about radiation. But I think part of it is just saying, hey, if we care about lifting people out of poverty, solving climate change, then let's take a look at the facts. And I think that made a big difference in Korea.
Let's look at our home country and where we have the largest nuclear fleet still, maybe not for long, the longest civilian nuclear history. And yet we've shut down plants in states that are deregulated where the plants no longer are economically viable. There's been a lot of activity at the state level to try and keep these plants from shutting down. You've been involved in this effort. What lessons learned are we seeing from this dynamic, not about whether we can build new plants, but just keeping the existing ones running? And how does that dovetail with your goals in terms of clean energy and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, it's been hugely successful. We were big risk of losing a bunch of plants in Illinois, New York, Connecticut. Looks like New Jersey's going to save its plants. All decided to save their nuclear plants, really on the basis of climate change. To some extent, they didn't want to be overly dependent on natural gas, which is what would happen. And, just telling the lawmakers the reality of their energy situation, the truth about nuclear had a big impact. I think we got to be more ambitious now. Nuclear is still just 20% of our electricity. We should be more like France, right? It should be like 70, 80%. The big opportunity is I think we're going to move to electric cars, but we should also be electrifying heating. If you really are serious about climate change, you need 100% of your electricity to come from clean energy, but then you also need to power your cars and generate your heat with clean energy. That's going to require a lot of nuclear. So I think the industry is in a place of transition. I think it's still kind of suffering battered wife syndrome, kind of wanting to hide its light under a bushel.
Yeah.
And I think we're coming to a new, younger generation. People are more assertive. They're more excited. They're more optimistic. And I think you're seeing that energy showing up in new leadership, saying, "Hey, let's be more ambitious here. Let's get more nuclear going."
How much does electricity or the electrification of transportation excite you and then also scare you? Because on the one hand, it sounds great, and people buy the Ford,
Right.
Prius that they feel good about. But if they're then charging it from electricity from a coal plant,
Right.
it's causing more harm than doing good. So yes, electric vehicles, but if we don't solve where the electricity is coming from, how nervous are you about that? And then I'll just throw on there, because I've been reading about it recently.
Yeah.
Bitcoin and mining Bitcoin, and we're hearing the power drain, and Iceland is one of these places now where people are mining Bitcoin because it's cold and they have the power, but it's overwhelming some power systems because of all the drain. So we see these new developments in terms of the way our society is evolving, where we're becoming more electricity intensive.
Yes.
Which can be a good thing in some ways, but if we don't solve it on the generation side, we may be doing more harm than good.
Absolutely agree, 100%. It's something we should be very worried about. If you go from burning oil in your cars to burning electricity from coal, you just created more pollution. So yeah, totally worry about it. I think a broader perspective on energy transitions, every time you go from wood to coal, coal to oil, to natural gas, to uranium, you're using more energy, but the energy you're using is cleaner. And it's often those energy transitions are actually driven by the transportation sector, right? So it was, why did we start using coal? Why did we start using a lot of coal to use it in the trains and the ships? Why did we move to oil to replace the coal and the trains and ships? Electricity, electric trains, and so you kind of go, next phase of transportation revolution, self-driving cars, electric cars, what are they going to be powered by? And I think that could be very good for nuclear, because low electricity demand in the United States right now is a big problem for nuclear. Problem for everybody, arguably. Maybe a bigger problem for nuclear. So I think, but yeah, I think you've got to do both. You've got to put that pressure on the supply side to get clean, but also I think embrace this new demand coming from electric vehicles at the same time. Could be very positive, could be very negative. We've got to get on the right side of it.
I mean, when you look at the numbers, whether it's our climate change targets or amount of real estate used for nuclear versus renewables or efficiency levels, the numbers, when you look at the numbers from, call it, reliable sources, the numbers are fairly unequivocal in terms of the need for nuclear and the place for nuclear. Yet nuclear isn't winning on the math, or it hasn't won on the math. And the math seems fairly simple. Where do you think the disconnect is? And is it just a matter of continuing to push that information out in a better way? Or is it something different?
I think it's both. I mean, I think that the nuclear community, which I would define as the industry, the scientific community, the folks at the scientific labs and the universities, and environmental activists like myself, I think we all have to do a better job of presenting a positive vision of the future and explaining how nuclear fits into it than we've done. I mean, myself have been focused on kind of protecting nuclear plants and preventing them from being replaced by greenhouse gas emissions. Haven't had enough time to really talk about this a better world, right? Everybody living, prosperous lives, abundant energy lives, abundant housing, abundant goods with a lower environmental impact. I always point out, what you want to do is conserve the use of material resources. You want to use energy to do that. Energy is a way you use less matter, right? Equals MC squared. If you use more energy, then you don't have to use as much natural resource. So I think we've done a poor job of that. I think it's just been a community that's been beaten up for so long. They just kind of, people are like, just don't hit me. And it's a little bit of hiding your light under a bushel. I think you just got to be like, look, this is the best way we have of making electricity, the best way we have of making heat. Got to be taking advantage of that. I do think technological innovation plays a role too, though I'm much more of an advocate of incremental innovation when it comes to nuclear, just because it's such a capital-intensive, path-dependent technology. But there's new fuels that are being tested right now that hold the potential to not melt down. If that happens, You could lower the regulatory burden and get big cost savings as well.
Where does government come into all of this? I mean, we look at a country like the UAE that made a national decision, we're going nuclear,
Right.
and it happened. You have the UK where they're trying, but they did a lot on the front end in terms of making it a national dialogue before reaching a conclusion and putting that to the populace. This is what we need to do.
Right.
We're both in a country where national energy planning is not necessarily our strength. But whether it's the United States or elsewhere, how important is government in terms of seeing this through and driving the process as opposed to letting the market take care of it itself? Where's the balance in all of that in your view?
Yeah, and I mean, and as you know, right, since electricity is a natural monopoly, right, you don't really want to have a bunch of companies competing to string copper wire to your home. We've tended to have a pretty good system, I think, which is that you have a monopoly that you regulate. So you can make a profit, but you can't price gouge by using your monopoly power. I think that system has worked great. I don't see a big need to change it. And the utilities can be public, they can be private, they just need to be regulated, and then you need to have a kind of a negotiation. Yeah, you're right about the United States. We don't do a lot of that planning, but
we've deregulated a lot of markets.
We've deregulated, though. You look at these markets. I'm always scratching my head because they go, "Well, this is a deregulated market." I'm like, "Well, the government sure is involved quite heavily in a bunch of different ways, right? I mean, it's a big part of your business probably is managing all of the different government regulations in supposedly deregulated markets. And to some extent, they've been positive because they've allowed natural gas to replace coal. But I think in other ways they haven't been so positive because, when you go to the grocery store, and if your grocery store doesn't have apples, you go next door and maybe they got apples. But if you're generating electricity, if you don't have clean energy, you don't have cheap, reliable electricity, you can't just go next door. It takes 10 years or more to build a plant. So you do need some of that long-term planning. Doesn't look like we're going to get a carbon price. But what we've argued for, and it's starting to happen a bit, is in the States to say you have a clean energy standard. You say, hey, we need a little bit more from clean energy every year. Just include nuclear in that, because that's going to get you to 100% clean energy much faster, and it allows for competition between the different technologies.
You mentioned a little bit before about new technologies. In the United States, there's probably 40 different developers of SMRs or advanced reactors. If you add in Canada, you're well over 50. There's no way that they're all going to make it.
Right, sure.
I mean, in terms of funding, in terms of just getting through the regulatory process. But at the same time, there are a lot of potential uses for these new technologies. How do you see that all shaking out? Is it going to be just a survival of the fittest? There's this view that, at least in the United States, the government should not pick winners. Yet, when you look at the military and how weapon systems are procured, they're picking winners all the time. So, if we look and say nuclear is important and we want to see these new technologies develop, given the unique challenges that the nuclear industry faces, do we need to see government having a stronger hand in all this to sort of bring these to the market faster? And I'll just ramble for another second, because if you look at the developing world, where you have the existing population that needs power, the population's growing, so not only do you need power for what's there, but you need even more. We want to get this type of clean generation more distributed to the world, and it's not quite yet ready. So is there a way to pull that forward? Can some national leadership possibly occur there, not just for the country, but even more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, the traditional line that's been drawn between where the government's job, ends and where the market begins has been demonstration. Government demonstrates, and in the private sector, in this case it'd be utilities, would go ahead and pick those up. Nuclear is tricky because I'll tell you the problem is that you need to run these plants for a few years before you know which one's the right one, and even then, it's hard to know based on the prototype that it's going to be this. That's why I sort of tend to favor with nuclear a more incremental approach. I'm all in favor of R&D and demonstration for these different designs. I think what's more potentially game-changing sooner are the new fuels. If you get fuels that can survive a loss of coolant, which is how accidents occur, the meltdowns. It can survive a loss of coolant for several hours or maybe even days. obviously you get a big safety benefit, and then you can reduce the regulatory burden as well and see some costs come down. It's interesting because we wrote a history of the fracking revolution. And people kind of go, oh, the fracking revolution was about fracking, but it turned out it was about like 3 big technologies coming together and combining. So we tend to be a little bit simplistic in our view of these technological changes. I think that what may be the future of nuclear might be using the same designs that we have, but with some different fuels and some better management techniques might be the key thing to make it cheaper than, say, coal or natural gas in the United States.
Earlier today, you talked about Diablo Canyon a bit, and when California was in the deepest parts of its drought, Diablo Canyon started reconfiguring to desalinate water for the local community. How excited do you get about nuclear's application for desalination in the developing world, but also when you look at some water-stressed areas, not just for the people, but the potential for conflict over water rights? Do you see nuclear as being a useful tool here, a realistic tool that is something that people need to think more about?
Oh, absolutely. And desalination's amazing. The funny, Diablo Canyon has 2 reactors, but it was designed for 5, and at least one of them was supposed to be used for desalination. It's not like our water scarcity is a new thing. We've always been dealing with it in California. And it's not just desalination. You can also recycle wastewater. It's kind of gross. People don't want to think about it, but you can just completely recycle all the wastewater and have beautiful, pure drinking water. Mainly, you just need cheap energy. Similarly, you can do the desalination, and in California, it's obviously a key place to do it. But yeah, just like you said, I think you can green your deserts. You can grow food in deserts. It's an amazing application for that because it does generate such high levels of heat and cheap electricity. So yeah, I just think the future of nuclear is a future of a greener world, a cleaner world, a world of abundant energy, not one of scarcity and limited resources.
The nuclear industry has been sort of challenged in getting its message out. And now we have a lot of groups, think tanks, NGOs, sort of promoting nuclear. We see, as you mentioned before, the UN, study on climate change, again, promoting nuclear. But is it going to take something at the national level, at the presidential level, or, pick your country, at that level of leadership to really make fundamental changes to say, we're not going about this the right way? Here are the goals. Very much like what you're doing on the environmental side is saying, my goal is this. These are the numbers. These are the tools that I have to use. And nuclear is one of them. And so we've just got to get it done. But doing it locally and organically is obviously very important. But to really make the changes to get to any of these goals in a meaningful way, does it have to be better articulated within the leadership of whatever country we're doing to have, not to say, I like nuclear, I like these things in nuclear, but to really promote, change the dialogue to one of promotion, but also articulation as to why?
I 100% agree. I mean, the big problem, of course, with at least in the United States, is that the utilities that own nuclear also own coal plants, natural gas, and renewables, and so they're hesitant to say that nuclear is the best. But that's what you would need to do, right? If you're a solar energy, if you're the Solar Industry Association, you don't say it's all good. You say solar's the best, right? So we need that for nuclear. I think the right institution to do it is actually the World Nuclear Association, because that's funded by the uranium companies. They don't have any conflicts. They should want to expand their market share. So I think that WNA, I'd love to see them play that role a little bit more. I've been encouraging them privately to do that, to speak about the fact that nuclear has a transcendent moral purpose. It was founded with the moral purpose of lifting everybody out of poverty and protecting the natural environment. But sometimes I think when you read the things that the industry says, including WNA, it has sort of it's all good and nuclear is not that bad, which is not that inspiring. And I think we've got to challenge ourselves to bring back some of that excitement and that enthusiasm for this better world, especially those institutions that just don't have any of those conflicts.
just to sort of wrap up,
Yeah.
in looking at things that you've done both in the U.S. and worldwide, and looking at where you hope to see things go, if you were to say there are 3 key points, either in terms of a message or in terms of programmatic changes, what are you seeing as the path to success in terms of not just the health of the nuclear industry, put that aside, climate change, reaching our goals, fostering development in an environmentally responsible way? What do you see as the 3 keys?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think the first is you start with prosperity. You know, I mean, that's when people care more about prosperity than they do the natural environment. Totally understandable. People need to understand you need abundant, cheap, and reliable energy to have universal prosperity. You know, those of us in the rich world, we forget that most people are just a lot poorer and they need abundant electricity. So that's got to be number 1. I think number 2 is obviously environmental protection. We've made a huge progress. You know, it wasn't like just a few years ago that Greenpeace publicly would deny that nuclear has a small environmental footprint, doesn't produce emissions. And I think the third part of it is peace. You know, we forget is atoms for peace. Eisenhower's famous United Nations speech in 1953. The idea was if you have nuclear energy, you're gonna have an incentive not to get a weapon. And we've seen that. No country has gotten an operating nuclear energy program and then decided to go out and get a weapon. In some ways, nuclear energy inoculates countries from wanting a weapon, from needing a weapon. And I always give the example of South Korea, which is obviously in the news right now. South Korea and North Korea. South Korea is a rich country now. You know, it's illuminated from outer space. You can see it lit up. 30% nuclear power, no weapon. North Korea, it's dark from outer space, no electricity, no nuclear power, but they have a weapon. They wanted to get nuclear energy, a bunch of problems occurred, they ended up getting a weapon. So I kind of look at that, I go, which world do we want? Do we want that illuminated South Korea world, or do we want that dark nuclear weapons world? Because that's the choice that we have.
Final question. From an development perspective, when you look at forecasts for infrastructure development, even moving outside of energy, and you look at the infrastructure we need in the United States, we get horrible grades in terms of infrastructure, the needs elsewhere in the world, the infrastructure is crumbling or needs to be developed, or both. The numbers are gargantuan in terms of the money that's needed. Energy falls inside of that for sure. And anything we're doing is going to require a very heavy lift in terms of financing. The money's got to come from somewhere.
Right.
And if you look at it at a project level, you think of it one way. If you think of it at a national level, you know, the decision France made in the 70s and 80s, where they made a heavy investment at the taxpayer's cost, but then the country benefited for years to come. How do you see us making the transformative change in terms of infrastructure development, including energy, to get to these goals? Do you see it public-private partnership? Do you see it government-led? Do you see it private sector-led, a combination of all? Where's the money coming from?
I think it's got to be a combination. I mean, at the end of the day, right? You always see this in electricity markets in particular. We say it's deregulated or regulated. It's always government's going to be involved, has to be involved. I think it's great to have the private sector involved. Going to demand some discipline and some, you know, cost efficacy. I wouldn't want to see it tilt too much in either direction. I like that hybrid model. I mean, one of the problems we saw in South Korea was that, you know, because the electric utilities are government owned, they couldn't defend their nuclear plants when they got an anti-nuclear president. You know, they had to do it kind of quietly. Similarly, I think a totally private sector effort wouldn't take into account the public interest in the way that it should. So I think it should be, you know, a hybrid model. I will say though, I think that when the people of a country want to do something, the money's there. You know, so there's plenty of money for solar and wind because people like solar and wind.
But then you've got to make the case to the people.
You've got to make the case to the people. It's got to come from the public.
Fair enough. Listen, I would be remiss before we end if I didn't sort of give you the opportunity to mention, you know, how people can learn more about what you're doing in terms of environmental progress in your TED Talk. So if you could maybe just finish with, hey, that sounded really good. Where could I get a little bit more of Michael Shellenberger?
That's right. So it's environmentalprogress.org. take a look at us online. Not for profit, independent of the industry, able to kind of come to our own conclusions. Have a bunch of TED Talks online. Would love to have folks watching as members.
Okay. Well, listen, this is fantastic. Thank you
Hey,
so much.
Thanks for having me.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, great. It's
Take
great being
care.
here. Good.